They built entire cities for one summer, and then erased them. Sounds like science fiction, right? But this isn't a movie. This is the official story. Imagine you're a regular guy from a farm, arriving in Chicago in 1893. In front of you rises a white dream city. Dozens of palaces, huge domes, endless columns, canals with boats, fountains, trams, and thousands of electric lights at night. All of this appears in just a few years. And then they burn it, tear it down, and say, it was only temporary. They tell us, relax, it was plaster, cheap decorations, nothing serious. But on the old photos you see something else. Massive arches, heavy statues, real roofs, full streets, whole districts. Underneath them, sewers, power plants, rail tracks. Simple question. Who builds all of that for one summer? And why does the same temporary miracle show up again in St. Louis, in San Francisco, and across Europe? Almost copy-paste. Maybe these weren't decorations at all. Maybe they were the last remains of another world, shown to the public one final time, and then wiped away. If they could erase an entire city and call it a fair, what else have they quietly erased from our history? Let's pause for a moment and really think about this. When you look at photos of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, officially called the Columbian Exposition, you are not seeing a festival. You are looking at an entire city. A city that, according to the official story, did not exist a few years earlier, and a city that, again according to that same story, was designed from the very beginning to disappear. On closer inspection, something in this picture feels deeply wrong. The White City covered over 600 acres. That is not a park with a few tents and stages. We are talking about roughly 200 major buildings, miles of paved streets, canals with bridges, a working elevated railway, and a massive electric power plant. The fairgrounds had their own police force, fire brigade, and postal system. Around 27 million people visited in 6 months, roughly half of the entire population of the United States at the time. In other words, this was not a small country fair. This was a fully functioning temporary metropolis. Yet we are told it was built in about 2 to 3 years, and then most of it was demolished or burned within a few months after closing. But wait, how is that supposed to work? Compare this to something we actually know from our own time. Modern cities struggle for years just to finish a single subway line. One contemporary airport terminal can take a decade. The renovation of one historic train station can turn into a political nightmare that drags on through several governments. And in the 1890s, we are asked to believe they somehow threw up an entire gleaming city with underground infrastructure, electrical grids, and monumental architecture, faster than we can build a shopping mall today. The contradiction is so obvious it forces you to stop and think. The official explanation sounds simple and reassuring. Most of the buildings, we are told, were temporary structures made of a material called staff, essentially plaster mixed with fiber over wooden frames. They were meant to be torn down. Grand theatrical scenery for a 6-month show and nothing more. On paper, that sounds neat. In reality, it collapses under scrutiny. Look at the photographs, not the pretty painted posters, the actual archival photos. You see massive colonnades that look like they are carrying real weight, deep cornices with intricate detailing, enormous domed structures that would need serious engineering just to avoid collapsing, statuary that appears to be carved stone, heavy balustrades and staircases built to carry thousands of people every day. Does any of this truly look like painted cardboard and cheap plaster? Once you start noticing these details, the official story begins to crack. If these were flimsy temporary pavilions, why install full sewage systems beneath them? Why lay miles of electric cable not only for decorative lights, but for power distribution across the entire grounds? Why build rail lines with proper grading and drainage that could easily last for decades? It feels less like a disposable stage set and more like permanent infrastructure built for something far more serious than a 6-month festival. And then there is the question almost nobody asks: where did all the debris go? Picture the demolition of around 200 large buildings, even if they were just plaster. That is thousands of tons of material: wooden frames, metal supports, glass, wiring, pipes, bricks from foundations. Where are the detailed records of this cleanup? Where was all of it taken? Who paid for the removal of this mountain of waste? The honest answer is uncomfortable. We do not really know. What we do know is this. Within 1 year of the fair's closing, almost nothing remained. A few buildings were relocated. 1 or 2 were kept as museums. But the vast majority? Gone. Burned in convenient fires. Demolished and cleared away. Almost as if the task was not just to shut down an exhibition, but to erase the city itself. That leads to a question that will haunt this entire story. What if we are not looking at a fair that was built from scratch, but at a city that was found, dressed up as an exposition, shown to the public, and then quietly erased? Once you notice the first crack in the dam, you cannot unsee it, and the water starts pouring through. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers do not care about feelings, and they rarely lie, even when stories do. The White City was not just big. For its supposed time frame, it was almost impossibly big. We are talking about over 200 buildings, around 65,000 square meters of glass, thousands of tons of steel framework, miles of electrical wiring, at a time when electricity itself was still a mystery for most people. Full water and sewage systems, paved roads, bridges, and working railways. And we are asked to believe all of this was designed, planned, and built in roughly 2 to 3 years. In the 1890s. But wait, how is that supposed to work in the real world? Today, with computer-aided design, prefabricated parts, hydraulic cranes, trucks, and global supply chains, we still struggle to finish a single large project in that kind of time. A modern stadium often takes 4 to 5 years. A big hospital complex can drag on for 6 to 8 years. And those are single building projects, not an entire artificial city district from scratch. Yet the official story calmly tells us that, with horses, hand tools, and steam power, they built faster and bigger than we can manage today. At some point, the contradiction becomes too large to ignore. Let's get more concrete. Take just one building, the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building. This one structure alone covered about 30 acres under a single roof. At that time, the largest enclosed space ever built on Earth. The roof required an intricate steel truss system. The foundations had to hold millions of pounds of weight. Inside, there were multi-level galleries, dozens of entrances, and a carefully planned ventilation system. Engineering something like this is not magic. It demands topographic surveys, soil testing, detailed architectural drawings, coordination of hundreds of workers, and solving problems no one has faced before at that scale. How much time did they supposedly have? According to official records, barely 18 months from breaking ground to completion. You do not have to be an engineer to feel that this is pushing the limits of believability. When you look closer, the timeline turns from impressive into almost absurd once you think about logistics. Where did all the materials come from? And how were they delivered? How do you move thousands of tons of steel, glass, and plaster into one area using rail, horses, and early steam engines? How many workers would need to be on site at the same time? How do you coordinate all of them without phones, radios, email, or any modern project management tools? The official answer is always the same vague story. They just did it. People worked very hard. It was a national priority. That is not an explanation. That is a way of shutting down questions. And this is the point where doubt stops being a small annoyance and turns into something heavier, something that changes how you see the whole picture. If these buildings were meant to be temporary, just pretty shells for a summer show, why invest so much into what lies underneath? They laid full sewer lines. Not simple ditches for rainwater, but actual sewers built to the standards of a real city. They installed underground electrical conduits designed to last, not just cables thrown on the ground for a fair. They graded and paved roads with proper foundations. They built heavy rail lines into and around the fairgrounds, not flimsy carnival tracks, but real railway infrastructure tied into the wider network. When you build something that is truly temporary, you do not pour money into the parts nobody will ever see. You do not over-engineer foundations. You do not install long-term utilities under a set that is supposed to vanish after one season. Unless you are not actually building a city from nothing, unless you are connecting to, adapting, or reusing something that was already there. It turns out that when you stop taking the official story at face value and start asking simple physical questions about time, weight, distance, and material, a very different picture begins to show through the cracks. A very different picture appears when you actually look at the photographs with fresh eyes. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you are standing in Chicago in 1892. The city is rough and unfinished, muddy streets, wooden shacks leaning into the wind, smoke pouring from factory chimneys, slaughterhouses and rail yards stretching toward the horizon. This is the Chicago of the Gilded Age, industrial, dirty, loud, chaotic. Now, open your eyes. It is 1893, and suddenly, on the shore of Lake Michigan, there is this, a gleaming city of white palaces, perfectly straight boulevards lined with colonnades, classical columns rising 3 stories high, enormous domes that seem to float above the water, some described as covered in gold leaf, canals with gondolas like a piece of Venice dropped into the Midwest. Electric lights reflected in the water at night, gardens with mature trees, sculpted lawns, and fountains. It really does look as if someone took a fragment of ancient Rome or some forgotten imperial capital and quietly placed it in North America. The official story claims this transformation happened in under 3 years. But once you start noticing the details, that claim stops sounding impressive and starts sounding absurd. Let us talk about the architecture itself, because this is where the whole temporary plaster story begins to fall apart. Look at the agriculture building. Massive Corinthian columns support a facade with intricate cornices and deep sculpted reliefs. The central dome alone would have required serious engineering calculations, even for a modern design office. Inside, you see several levels, grand staircases, galleries, and solid load-bearing walls. Nothing about this feels like a thin stage backdrop. Or take the Palace of Fine Arts, one of the very few buildings that survived. Why did it survive? Because it was built with real materials, brick, stone, and steel. Today it still stands as the Museum of Science and Industry. Officially, they tell us this was a special case, an exception built more solidly. But in the photographs, you see dozens of other structures with the same type of massive forms, the same deep shadows in the masonry, the same kind of monumental detail, identical quality, identical style, identical scale. So we have to ask, if one exception turned out to be a genuine long-lasting building, how many of the others were really so different? The more you look, the harder it becomes to believe that almost everything was just cheap plaster on sticks. Now, here is what makes this even more incredible. The level of artistic detail. We are not talking about flat painted walls. The buildings carry 3-dimensional sculptures, gods, angels, lions, historical figures, carved with striking precision. Long decorative friezes run for hundreds of feet. Each palace has its own unique patterns, masks, shields, wreaths, and figures. All of that would take skilled craftsmen months and months of focused work. Now place that into a timeline. You have to design each sculpture, model it, carve it, then install it high up on facades and domes. And you are doing this not for 1 or 2 buildings, but for around 200. All this while also building the structures themselves, in roughly 18 months of real construction time. At some point, this stops being a heroic story and starts sounding like a physical impossibility for the 1890s. But there is something even stranger. When you go looking for photographs of the construction phase, you expect to see chaos, half-finished walls, bare steel frames, forests of scaffolding, cranes, teams of workers setting huge columns in place. For a project at this scale, there should be entire albums of work-in-progress images. Instead, those images are rare, almost non-existent. What we see more often are photographs where the buildings look nearly complete, with workers cleaning, touching up details, or finishing surface work. Many scenes look less like active construction and more like restoration or preparation, as if something old is being repaired, washed, or dug out, not erected from nothing. The sites often give the impression of uncovering and dressing up a city rather than building a brand new one. And this leads us to the core question, the question that, once it appears in your mind, refuses to go away. What if the White City was not built for the fair at all? What if Chicago was chosen as the site of the Columbian Exposition precisely because of what already stood there by the lake? What if the fair itself was mainly a story? a convenient narrative pasted onto something much older, something that had to be explained to the public, displayed one last time, and then quietly erased from the map. What if the Columbian Exposition was simply a story, a ready-made script pasted onto something much older, something that had to be explained to the public, shown off one last time, and then quietly erased? The moment you even allow this idea into your head, as a simple thought experiment, the whole landscape of history shifts. Because Chicago was not alone. 11 years later, in 1904, St. Louis hosts the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. And when you look at the photographs, something unsettling happens. You do not just see a similar fair, you see almost the same city. Not just inspired by Chicago, not just same style. You see the same type of domes, the same colonnades, the same grand plazas with nearly identical fountains, the same neoclassical axes and sightlines. It is like someone copied and pasted entire districts from one fair to another with a giant architectural shortcut. The more you compare, the harder it becomes to pretend this is just coincidence. Then comes San Francisco, 1915, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Once again, enormous white palaces, perfectly symmetric master plan, monumental gateways, huge sculptures, complex electrical systems, water features, and long processional avenues. Once again, built in roughly 3 years, taken apart within months of closing. Look around the map of that era and the same pattern pops up in smaller but very similar forms. Buffalo, 1901. Omaha, 1898. Atlanta, 1895. Each time, the same strange rhythm. Build impossibly fast. Dazzle the world for one season. Declare it temporary. Burn it, dismantle it, or let it accidentally go up in flames. Leave almost nothing behind except a few fragments and some carefully chosen photos. At a certain point, you can no longer call this a one-off miracle. It starts to look like a system. Now, pause and look at this from the point of view of an architect or a city planner. You do not accidentally recreate the same monumental language again and again in different cities. You do not keep stumbling into identical solutions for domes, columned halls, and grand staircases on opposite sides of the country. Yet the official version expects us to believe that separate teams, with different leadership and budgets and politics, somehow produced what looks like modular, prefabricated cityscapes, interchangeable chunks of the same architectural world, dropped into different locations and then removed. It feels less like a series of unique creative projects and more like someone was following a master template. And then we hit the same wall we met in Chicago. Where did all the material go after each fair? Thousands of tons of steel, glass, and stone, miles of copper wiring, massive statues and reliefs, timber, brick, roofing, hardware. After Chicago, after St. Louis, after San Francisco, after all the others. Where are the detailed demolition reports, the contracts, the freight records showing where all of this was hauled away and reused? Once again, they are almost invisible. Instead of clear documentation, we get vague lines in the history books. The buildings were dismantled. Many materials were recycled. Several structures were lost in fires. Others are described as if they simply disappeared when the fair ended. The tone is always the same. It was temporary. It served its purpose. It is gone now. Do not worry about it. But the real tension starts when you put the photographs from these different expositions side by side. Because when you do that, it stops feeling like a series of cute local festivals and starts looking like we are staring at the ghost images of one erased architectural order, briefly lit up, renamed as fairs, and then systematically removed from the story. But the real questions begin when you lay the photographs side by side, because that is when you realize these fairs were not only about architecture or engineering tricks, they were about something much deeper. The quiet rewriting of collective memory. Let us look at what a World's Fair actually does to the human mind. Millions of people, farmers, factory workers, immigrants, families with children, arrive from every corner of the country and from overseas. Most of them have never left their small towns. Many have never seen electric light with their own eyes. Some have never stood next to a building taller than 3 stories. And suddenly, they walk into this, a shining white city that looks as if it dropped out of the sky. Electric lights everywhere, moving sidewalks, telephones, X-ray machines. New machines and inventions humming in every hall. Exotic pavilions from distant countries. Everything glowing, everything labeled as modern, everything presented as the future. What happens to your sense of reality after that? You go back home. You sit at your kitchen table and try to explain it to your friends and your children. You talk about this impossible city by the water, the fountains, the lights that never seem to go out. In your head, a sharp line appears. Before the fair. After the fair. The old world you grew up in. And the new world you just visited. And then a darker thought appears. What if that psychological split was the real goal all along? If you step back and look at the timeline, the 19th century world's fairs appear at a very specific moment in history, right after waves of massive upheaval. Wars and revolutions, empires breaking apart, great city fires, epidemics, whole districts needing reconstruction, infrastructure that supposedly has to be rebuilt from the ground up. Then, almost on cue, the fairs. And with them comes a fresh, polished story, a new timeline, new national heroes, new official histories in school books, a new architectural language that suddenly starts showing up in modern government buildings, banks, museums, and train stations, almost as if the fairs were a live catalog, teaching people what the new world is supposed to look like. In other words, the fairs did not just showcase the present. They defined what the present meant and where the future was supposed to go. Now comes the really uncomfortable part. If you wanted to reset collective memory, to insert a new historical narrative into an entire civilization, how would you actually do it? You would create a spectacle so overwhelming that it becomes the main reference point in millions of minds. You would guide crowds through it, let them see progress with their own eyes, let them ride it, hear it, and touch it. You would sell them postcards, photographs, and souvenirs so they could carry the new story home. You would not just tell them the new narrative, you would make them feel they had witnessed it, and everything that came before, everything that did not fit into the new script, you would label it temporary. You would strip it, burn it, or quietly demolish it. You would build new structures on top of its foundations. You would say it was just scenery, that it never really mattered, that it was always meant to disappear. At that point, the contradiction between what we are told and what we see in the images becomes so large, it forces you to question the whole frame. Look at those archival photographs again. Really look at them. Notice how many show the fairgrounds almost completely empty. Huge buildings, perfectly clean streets, full infrastructure, but very few people, almost no crowds, almost no construction crews. Just finished structures, sitting there in silence, waiting. It often looks less like a festival in full swing, and more like a stage viewing of a city that already existed, as if the architecture was already there, and the fair was just the story wrapped around it, a label, a theme, a short-term explanation. And once that story had been told, once millions had walked through it, believed it, absorbed it, the physical evidence could be removed without raising suspicion. The memory of the fair would survive, while the memory of what the buildings truly were would fade. So, we arrive at a disturbing possibility. What if the fairs were not really celebrations of progress, but funerals for a world we were never meant to remember? What if the fairs were not celebrations of progress, but funerals for a world we have forgotten? This is the moment when everything shifts, when simple curiosity turns into something heavier, when questions stop being a fun game and become a weight you carry mostly on your own. Imagine you are sitting up late at night with hundreds of old photographs spread across your desk. Maps, building plans, newspaper clippings. You have spent months, maybe years, collecting pieces of this puzzle, and slowly, quietly, the official story stops making sense. Here is what almost nobody tells you about going down this path. It is lonely. You try to explain your doubts to friends. You show them the photographs, point to the contradictions, walk them through the timeline step by step, and you get that look, the half smile that says, "You are overthinking this. It was just plaster. They worked hard. Why are you so obsessed with this anyway?" It matters because once you see the cracks, you cannot unsee them. let us pause for a moment and be fair. The standard explanations are not completely stupid. Some parts do have logic. Yes, temporary buildings were a real thing. Yes, fires happened. Many of these structures were covered in highly flammable materials. Yes, money plays a role. It is expensive to maintain empty fairgrounds once the crowds are gone. Some of these points explain something, but they do not explain everything. Some gaps are so huge you could drive a train straight through them. Why are there so few construction photographs for projects on this massive scale? Why do detailed demolition records barely exist? Why did several cities experience similar mysterious fires that conveniently wiped out their fairgrounds? Why does this entire architectural style appear fully formed, as if it did not slowly evolve, but just dropped into history overnight? Here is the uncomfortable truth. Both extremes are dangerous. Blindly accepting official stories turns you into a passive receiver of whatever narrative you are given. But falling into total paranoia, seeing secret plots in every missing page, can make you lose touch with reality altogether. So, the hardest question becomes, how do you stay sane between blind trust and absolute doubt? You sit there, surrounded by files and photos that do not quite fit together, and you ask yourself, am I simply connecting dots that are not meant to be connected? Or am I one of the few people actually noticing what is in plain sight? The reality is, we may never know with full certainty what really stood on those fairgrounds. Archives burn, records vanish, witnesses die. Official accounts are written and rewritten by winners, governments, and institutions with their own motives. Maybe many of those buildings were inherited from an older, unknown layer of civilization. Maybe they truly were built in a rush with techniques and skills we have underestimated or forgotten. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Some structures old, some new, carefully mixed together so that no one can clearly separate one from the other. Or maybe, and this is the thought that keeps you awake at 3 a.m, maybe the evidence was erased so thoroughly that all we have left are ghosts. Faint shapes in photographs, strange jumps in timelines, questions that can never be fully answered no matter how deep you dig. Because if you really wanted to hide something, the smartest tactic would not be to deny it ever existed. The smartest tactic would be to give it an explanation so boring, so widely accepted, that no one even thinks to question it. It was just a fair, just temporary buildings, nothing special, nothing to see here. But once that simple explanation starts to crack, even a little, something else begins to show through underneath. And when the layer of paint flakes away, you realize it is not just the story of the fairs that is tilting. It is your whole picture of the world. And maybe that is the real gift of these erased cities. Not a clean, final answer, but a new way of seeing. Let's be honest. We may never prove beyond all doubt whether the fair buildings were inherited or truly constructed from scratch. The evidence is broken into pieces. The records are patchy. Official stories contradict themselves. Archives have burned. Blueprints have vanished. Witnesses left accounts that do not line up. But something important has changed in you, and that matters more than any single conclusion. You no longer swallow official narratives without thinking. You have learned to look with your own eyes, to notice what is missing from a story, not only what is written down, to ask simple physical questions about time, weight, materials, and labor that almost nobody else bothers to ask. That is not paranoia. That is the beginning of waking up. When you study these erased fairgrounds closely, they teach a hard lesson. How easily a story can be poured over physical reality like fresh paint. How a few years of spectacle can reshape a whole century of memory. How buildings can stand, photographs can exist, millions of people can walk through a place. And within one generation, it can all be reduced to a throwaway line. Oh, that was just temporary. If they could do that with entire city districts, it is fair to ask, what else have they done it to? Now, look around your own town. That old train station with stonework that seems far too elaborate for its supposed date. The courthouse with carved details that would take modern craftsmen years and a huge budget to reproduce. The strange archway in the park that nobody can clearly explain. The tunnels under downtown that have always been there but never seem to have a real origin story. What if these are not odd little exceptions? What if they are fragments? Remnants of a layer nobody talks about. Once you start noticing details like that, you see them everywhere. buildings that do not quite match their official construction dates, bridges and viaducts that seem wildly over-engineered for the traffic they carry today. Architectural styles that appear almost fully formed, without the usual messy evolution and failed experiments you would expect. So, the real question is no longer, were the fairs fake? The real question becomes, what does it mean to live in a world where entire cities and their stories can be erased and rewritten? It means your textbooks might be edited versions, not the full script. It means your maps might only show what someone chose to keep. It means the story you were told about your own civilization might be exactly that, a carefully curated story. But here is what nobody planned for. Some of us learned how to look closer. Official history says the fairs were temporary, the buildings were demolished, and nothing truly important was lost. Yet the photographs remain, the contradictions remain, the unanswered questions remain. And as long as we can still see the outlines on the ground, the strange empty plots, the two perfect parks, the one or two exceptional buildings that somehow survived, the story is not over. It is just waiting for someone who knows how to read the traces. You do not need to prove everything. You do not need to solve every mystery or win every argument. You just need to stop taking the surface as the whole truth. Walk slower through your city. Run your hand over the old stone. Ask older people about buildings that were always there. Notice what feels off, what does not quite fit the timeline you were given. Because doubt is not a curse. It is a tool. And curiosity is not madness. It is a compass pointing you out of the story you were handed, and toward the one that might actually be real. And once you learn to use those tools, doubt and curiosity, you start seeing the world in a new way, layered, uneven, and full of carefully constructed silences. They built entire cities for one summer. Or maybe they borrowed them. Then they erased them, burned them, buried them under highways, stadiums, and parking lots, reduced them to one dry line in history books that says, temporary structures no longer extant. But the photographs remain, and photographs do not lie in the same way stories do. They quietly show what was really there, even when the captions try to push you in another direction. What if I told you that right now, under your feet, there might be infrastructure older than anyone admits, that the building you walk past every day might have a construction date that does not match its level of craftsmanship, that your city's founding legend might be sitting on top of something older, something deliberately blurred out? The official narrative only falls apart if you are willing to push on it, if you are ready to scrutinize what you were never meant to think about. The white city of Chicago, the dreamscapes of St. Louis, San Francisco, Buffalo, the grand expositions of Paris, Brussels, Barcelona, each one appearing almost overnight by historical standards, each one too beautiful, too detailed, too heavily engineered to be honestly described as temporary, each one torn down, burned, or dismantled before people could start asking the wrong kind of questions. So, what were they really showing us? A preview of the future, or a carefully staged memory of the past? Seen from this angle, the 19th century world's fairs begin to look less like innocent celebrations and more like a global reset, a coordinated way to roll out a new timeline, a new story about progress, a new picture of what civilization is supposed to look like. And anything that did not fit that new story, anything that hinted at an older, more advanced, more mysterious layer of humanity, it was labeled temporary, then quietly removed. But there is one thing they could not erase: the questions, the contradictions, the physical impossibilities baked into the official timeline, the photographs that show too much detail, the site plans that reveal far too much infrastructure for something sold as just a fair. You can burn buildings. You cannot burn the questions they leave behind. So, what do we do with this? How do we live with the idea that our history might be a carefully edited cut, and our cities might stand on the bones of a world we were not meant to remember? We become investigators of our own reality. We stop waiting for permission to doubt. We start trusting our own eyes more than the neat explanations handed to us. When you look at old photographs of your city, ask, where did these buildings really come from? When a plaque says constructed in 1890, ask, how exactly? With what tools? In what time frame? Where are the construction photos, the scaffolding, the messy middle? When you walk through a park and notice strange stone foundations or lone arches, ask, what stood here before playgrounds and lawns? And when someone shrugs and says, nothing important, ask yourself, then why does it look so carefully built? The answer becomes hard to ignore once you stop simply accepting and start really observing. They built entire cities for one summer, or they found them. Either way, they showed them to the world one last time, and then they erased them. But as long as we can still see the cracks in the story, the erasure is not complete. It is just waiting for enough people to finally look.